Hello, thank you so much for coming to our session. So we are the Middle East Treaty Organization, METO. We essentially are a coalition of civil society activists and practitioners, and we are working on our main and final goal of eradicating weapons of mass destruction from the Middle East region. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to achieve that through a number of different ways. That includes a draft treaty text, which kind of acts as like the first kind of proposal on how we could go about doing that in a practical way through policy change and whatnot. Through citizen diplomacy and through outreach and activism with other NGOs and other individuals who are really committed to this cause, and also through education, which is something we've kind of dabbled in recently with the launch of our METO University Network. So I think this session is going to be a really interesting space for us to kind of like explore what kind of possibilities lie ahead in terms of visualizing a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, but also to see how we can get there, what lessons we've learned so far, and also to tell you guys a little bit more about METO itself. So I'd like to introduce our directors. This is Tony Robinson, Sharon Dolev, and Emad Kiyaei. And I'm Anita, I'm a program associate at METO, and I think I can hand over to you so you can get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Anahita. Thank you, everybody, for coming and showing up at this after lunch hard hour. We'll try to keep you awake. As you probably know already, there are 9 nuclear armed states, right? This is very bad news and good news at the same time. If you looked at the 60s and then the 70s and then the 80s, we were not sure that that will be, that will end up with 9 nuclear armed states. We already know, and you heard a lot, so I don't want to repeat, what will happen if there will be a nuclear war. And I'm not just talking about a nuclear war between the US and Russia. I'm talking about even a tiny nuclear war between India and Pakistan, for example. What happens if only one tiny nuclear bomb will detonate? The whole world will suffer. That brought civil society from around the world this research that showed what happens even if there's a tiny nuclear war. Brought civil society from around the world to push states to write, to negotiate, and then sign the ban treaty, the TPNW. Now that's amazing, that's great, and as I kid in Israel, I couldn't stop celebrating. However, we still have 9 nuclear armed states, and I don't care. I know politically I'm not supposed to call Israel, Pakistan, North Korea, and India nuclear armed states, but I really don't want to play the game with the politicians. There are 9 nuclear armed states. And if we want to move forward, and I guess we do, we need to find a way to disarm them. We talked a lot about nonviolence today in Tony's workshop and how you talk to states. Now, we know now, I think, that by bashing the 9 nuclear armed states, we won't get much. I mean, yeah, it works for some steps, but not enough for them to choose to disarm. Now we know that no matter what we'll do, the US will not disarm unless Russia will disarm. China won't disarm if it's the only one to disarm. India will not disarm if Pakistan will not disarm. But if we're looking at one of the nuclear 9 states, Israel, which I'm only looking at separately because I was born there and that's, where I'm working. If I'm looking at Israel, what is the nuclear adversary for Israel? It's not Iran. You know why? You know why it's not Iran? Anyone? Because Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. That's why. I mean, I know it sounds like they do, but they don't. So Israel doesn't have a nuclear adversary. Israel, though, is in the middle of a zone, the Middle East, a zone in which Israel doesn't feel safe. So if we want Israel to disarm, we need to create a zone in which Israel might feel safe enough to disarm. When we can bash Israel, it's fun, but it won't disarm Israel. Now, if you look at the zone, and we'll look at it a little bit closer in a few minutes, you understand that just talking about Israel joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Israel should do this, Israel should do that. I mean, we've done that almost since the beginning of Israel. It didn't work. If you just talk about nuclear weapons, you single out Israel, and again, the discussion is just about Israel. But if you talk about all weapons of mass destructions, if you talk about all those weapons that are you said indiscriminated, thank you. I haven't been on board there for so long, I forgot my English. If you look at all those weapons, chemical, biological, and nuclear, you see that there was threats, usage, and the discourse, when you talk about weapons of mass destruction, is then a regional discourse, and not just a discourse that focuses in one state, and actually the one state that we want to bring into the table. Right now, Israel is not taking part of any of the discussions. So for that, for us, it was obvious. If we want to do something, we have to think globally, of course, but we also have to think regionally to solve the one state out of the 9 states, and this is our responsibility. If we're activists and if we want to be responsible, we need to find ways to bring Israel to the table. We need to find ways to keep the Arab states and Iran at the table. And the biggest dream of all is what we want to have in this room is the one thing lacking, and that's goodwill, good faith, and discussions that might help the states to find a text that they can all agree on, all feel secured in, and move forward with disarming. And I would like to remind that disarmament is not just the dismantlement of the weapons. Disarmament is what actually already starts when people are talking to each other. So if we're looking at the zone, and if we're understanding that the zone needs a holistic solution, and it does, and also if we remember that the zone is not really in a bubble. I mean, people are talking about the Middle East. Most people don't even know where the Middle East really is, where it starts, where it ends. I'm quite sure that none of you know which states are in the Middle East. It's fine. I find it hard to remember myself. But people keep talking about the Middle East. We need to remember that it's not contained. So what happens in the Middle East affects the world. What happens in the world affects the Middle East. And another thing that we're trying to do is to change the discourse of the world with the Middle East and about the Middle East, and to stop the talk of the world at the Middle East. And if we want to do this, the first thing that we need to understand is a little bit about the Middle East, a little bit about the history, a little bit about the geopolitics. And there's somebody here that is brilliant with doing just that.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. So Sharon gave us a good starting point at what is the dilemma that we're facing, specifically in the Middle East. And here now, let's have a quick context to this conversation. Yeah, where is the Middle East? And what are the countries that make up the Middle East? We have 22 Arab countries that make up the Arab League, plus Iran and Israel. These are the 24 countries whereby they have to come together and agree on a pathway towards establishing a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. Just to give you a geographical reach of this, these 24 countries that encompass North Africa and Western Asia is 3 times the size of the European Union. It has 700 million people that inhabit it. And if collectively we can put their economies together, it would be the 4th largest economy in the world. So this is a vast region that goes all the way east to Iran, all the way west to the Western Sahara, to Morocco. It goes south to the Comoros Islands and has diverse countries from Sudan to Djibouti to Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and Libya, and across this massive region. So it's a task grand in scale. But the good news is all of those 24 countries, either directly or indirectly, have approved and are signing on board the end state of what we're trying to achieve, which is a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. That means that we do not want the production, use, stockpiling of the 3 classes of weapons of mass destruction: nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and biological weapons. Now, since the use of the nuclear weapons by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no other country has used it on a population group, while testing of nuclear weapons has caused enormous amounts of damage and to the environment and to the local populations who lived in these places. And the Middle East was not immune to that because of the history of colonization, the use and testing of nuclear weapons by the French in Algeria, for example, had continued for many years. So we have the geography, we know the countries, and the zone that we want to create is to eradicate these weapons from one of the most volatile regions in the world. How volatile we'll get into in a few minutes. But to understand what does that actually mean in practice is that these 24 governments have to negotiate that is being based on a history of where we are and what is the idea of a WMD-free zone comes from. Let's quickly go through a timeline. 1974, Egypt and Iran at the United Nations proposed a nuclear weapons-free zone. And that came about because there was a lot of rumors that there's one state that has acquired nuclear weapons, that being Israel, with the help of many Western powers, specifically the French, who provided the reprocessing facilities in the Dimona reactor in a desert called Negev. So with that suspicion, and to stop the spread of nuclear weapons by other countries, the Iranians and Egyptians proposed this. Boom, that was passed. And every year the resolution was passed to move forward with establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone. However, it was very little tangible results because some argued, and the Israeli government's position was, that you're singling us out, that we will only discuss any form of disarmament in regards to nuclear or any other WMDs once there is peace and recognition by all the member states of the Middle East. So that puts it into a long corridor of discussion. Whereas the Egyptians' Arab position plus the Iranians was that by achieving a nuclear weapons-free zone, we are already moving towards recognition, peace, and security as a collective. So there's a dilemma of how do we move forward with this. Fast forward, and we are in 1990. By this dragging of the feet of the international community on moving forward on a nuclear weapons-free zone, the Egyptians, again, with the backing of the Iranians, proposed, you know what, how about this? We don't talk about just nuclear weapons, let's expand it, let's include the chemical weapons and biological weapons, because there are some countries who possess or had the capability of developing chemical weapons. And the Middle East has a long history of the use of chemical weapons, from the Egyptians on the Yemenis in 1960s, to the use by Saddam Hussein, Iraqi dictator, during the Iran-Iraq war, over 8 years, where the Iraqis used chemical weapons on Iranian civilians and military and on their own people, the Kurds. So there was already a history of their use of WMDs, specifically chemical weapons in the region. And more lately, of course, with the civil war and the quagmire that we are facing in Syria, there's been many instances of chemical weapons use. So by achieving an expansion on the domain of all of the three WMDs, the idea was that, all right, maybe now we can move forward and establish it. But as we are standing here, the WMD-free zone in the Middle East is still an ongoing project. And while there's been some progress, and that progress came about because they were so frustrated, the Arabs and the Iranians and others in the region were saying, you're not making any advancements towards establishing this zone, so let's try to figure out how we can move this forward. In 1995, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the pillar of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and disarmament for over 70 years, was that if we are going to extend this treaty, can it be that it can be attached to making real tangible changes and moving forward on establishing the zone? So these negotiations in 1995 resulted in the indefinite extension of the NPT. What does that mean? There's no expiry date. And that was attached to allowing for this movement towards WMD-free zone. And that was a compromise that was made with the Arab countries so that they can actually support the indefinite extension of the NPT. From 1995 till 2018, numerous occasions and numerous attempts were made to move the countries together to negotiate a treaty and under international law that will establish this zone. And the frustration grew. And in 2018, Egyptians again proposed at the United Nations General Assembly a resolution. Why don't we start an annual conference under the auspices of the United Nations Secretariat that will bring these governments together to just have to work on one mandate. What's the mandate? Negotiate, freely arrived at, through consensus. Imagine, 24 countries have to agree to this text. Negotiate how are we going to go about establishing the zone. It's a treaty. It's a document that has all the, the articles. How do we dismantle? How do we provide verification, monitoring, and all of that? And that began and was passed. And the first one happened just in 2019, in November. And it was known as the November Conference. We were there as METO, as one of the few civil society organizations that were allowed to even be in the premises, to be engaging on this issue. And from all those 24 countries, 22 Arab countries were there, plus Iran, world powers, which are the P5, United States, China, Russia, UK, and France. And from those ones, the US didn't show up. And from the region, Israel did not show up. But you know what? Their seat is still in the room. And until this mandate is then completed, every year there will be a conference. One is going to happen this year later on, in just over a month. And we're ready. Because what we do at METO is to provide a pathway, a solution, an idea, something that the governments can look at, and it could be a food for thought. And that is our draft treaty that is evolving. We bring experts from around the world that are focusing on biological, chemical, and nuclear science. And we have this technical team, and we also have, diplomats, former diplomats, and government officials that provide the context, which is the geopolitics, and how we can convince these governments to move forward to an agreed upon text. So this is what's happening in the world of WMD-free zone in the Middle East. But all of that is happening within the context of a very troubled region. The reason why we were working towards WMD-free zone in the Middle East is primarily because we need to take these weapons out of the hands of this volatile region, which is dominated by civil war, sectarian war, ideological war. There is animosities amongst key countries in the region. Some countries don't recognize each other. We are currently in a cold war between Iran and Israel through sabotage, assassinations, and an array of activities. And this comes in addition to the power dynamics between Saudi Arabia and Iran and their influence through their proxy wars and supporters, may that be in Yemen, may that be in Lebanon, or in Syria. And to make this even more complicated is the role of global powers, including many European countries that continue to have their allies and their stakeholders that they support in various ways, including dropping and fueling the most militarized region in the world. That weapons or the means of war do not come to the Middle East out of thin air. They come from countries, many of them from United States, Russia, China, Germany, France, Spain too. They are the largest exporters of the means of war in the Middle East. So let's not forget that. And with that,
UK.
Oh, I forgot about the British. All right. Thanks for reminding me. Let's not forget that this Middle East and these lines, these borders, were designed, signed on behalf of those who had nothing to do with the region, and they were the British, the French, the Ruskies, and the Americans. And when we combine the role of the global powers in creating the mess that we are in the Middle East right now, is the reason that it has to take an Iranian, an Israeli, and our colleagues that are from across the region and the world to come together and say, you know what, there is a different way. And there is a pathway forward, and we're going to give you some options. And look at it, because the vision of the future for the Middle East is now at a crossroad. We can either move towards a trajectory that brings about peace and security and tranquility and prosperity for those who inhabit this geography and its environment, or we continue this drag on this region to be drenched of its resources, most importantly, human and ecological. And we will talk about it more as we go along. And you'll see that what it is, why it is important for us here in Europe. I'm sorry to say, you are surrounded to your south, to your east, and to your southeast by the Middle East. So like it or not, you got to deal with that stuff at some point. So no walls are going to keep away all of the challenges that are happening in the Middle East, because it will eventually reach your shores, and already has. So with that, I'll pass to Sharon for the next. But we maybe have a quick Q&A. No? You want to go ahead?
Sorry, unless there is a need. Anyone wants to ask something? So, civil society, what can we do, right? I'll tell you the story of METO, how it started. I'll try to do it shortly. There's so many nice stories to tell. We started very small as the Israeli Disarmament Movement, which is a name that we never gave ourselves. Actually, our original name was, and that's how we registered in Israel, was Regional Peace and Disarmament Movement, RPM. It's just that nobody remembered that, and everybody called us Israeli Disarmament Movement, and then because in this world everybody loves acronyms, we became IDM. So we created also a nice picture, put IDM and took the name. Okay. We wanted to bring Israel to the table. We wanted to open discourse in Israel. In Israel, there's a secret. You do not talk about it. There's the ambiguity policy. It means that we're not supposed to talk, to think, to argue, to write about nuclear weapons. That's what we know. We thought, even lots of leftists in Israel thought, that talking about nuclear weapons, the Israeli program, about Iran, it's okay. They don't have nuclear weapons, but we can talk about the nuclear weapons all the time. But about our own, we thought it's totally illegal. So we thought, how do we know what is okay to say and what is not okay to say if you want to have a campaign in Israel? And we just started, tried. It took 6 months of trying to say this. We didn't get arrested, and then we tried to do that, and we didn't get arrested, and then we tried to say that. But we also didn't get the attention of anyone. Nobody wanted to write about what we're doing. Nobody. We tried different messages. We started actually the Humanitarian Campaign in 2008 in Israel, even before ICANN started the Humanitarian Campaign, because it was so effective in Israel. That's just telling people about what a global war, the nuclear war, will do to them. What a tiny war will do to the people in Israel, and what will happen to Israelis if Israel will use its own nuclear weapons, took the hands off people's ears, and they wanted to know how. So that's great. We got people to be afraid again from nuclear weapons, which was missing in the entire world, because the entire world learned how to live with nuclear weapons and forgot to be afraid of them. And we managed to do that in the campaign in Israel a little bit. To get to the attention of the media was much harder. We had to do non-violent direct actions that were so creative and a bit hard to get, just so we can get a glimpse of camera watching at us. One of our most famous events was when we found a way to insert ourselves into a very big conference with mainly for the military, intelligence, missile buildings, and all this industry, with President Peres as the main speaker, the father of Israel's nuclear program. The conference was called Nuclear Challenges in the Middle East, and we wanted to say something about it, and we managed to get in. And because we wanted to be non-violent, but we needed the cameras to show us, we realized that we have to get as close to the president as possible. And after lots of deliberations, realized that the only way to do it is if we take our clothes off, and then we're not a threat, right? If you go like this and you don't have to conceal and think, you can walk right towards the president, everybody will be too shocked to hold you. Also, people don't like to hold naked people. So we made banners called Stripping the Middle East from Weapons of Mass Destruction, and we did exactly that. It went on the media in Israel, outside of Israel. Actually, the Israeli media wanted to not show it, and for 1 hour they tried to totally ignore us, but BBC, Iran, Fox News, CNN, everybody showed it. And then, according to foreign sources, Israel was able to show it again. And that's one way of how civil society can help us. If you speak outside, we can speak inside. Or it's making it easier for us. But then it's very important what it is that you're saying, of course. So we had a campaign in Israel. It was a successful campaign. It's a successful campaign to a point, meaning we learned the message, we learned the story, we understood how to get to the media. I started to be interviewed in IDF radio, which is one of the national radios. I still do from time to time. I got invited to speak about Fukushima because in Israel there was no one to even speak against nuclear energy, because when you don't speak about nuclear, you don't speak about nuclear. But there was a problem. We kept saying Israel needs to disarm. People started to say yes, Israel needs to disarm. We said you should not attack Iran. You know, remember when during Obama regime there was see what they did there? During the Obama regime. When there were all these talks of all options are on the table, but the talks were not an option yet. All options were either war or more sanctions. We did big demonstrations. And big for us is 300 people in front of the Ministry of Defense saying, and in front of the American Embassy and everywhere, like every week, demonstrating, don't bomb talk. If you look for don't bomb talk, you'll see a big banners, and it made it around the world. The pictures, the media took it, it was great. Don't bomb talk. And this was another successful campaign. And the other successful campaign was exactly that. People wanted to find, so how can Israel disarm? And that was the problem, because we didn't know how Israel can disarm safely in this environment, or how can we bring Israel to the table if there's not a regional solution. And at that point, especially because the campaign in Israel, this is something we can talk about, was almost never funded. So lots of people were really appreciative of our campaign, but nobody wanted to put money in this campaign. So it was a tiny campaign. At some point, we realized we can't continue campaigning on something. We got where we wanted. People realized nuclear weapons are bad. I got one of the major fascist reporters, anchor, very famous, to say, okay, we got it. Nuclear weapons are bad. You know, great. I got my biggest enemy or nemesis saying exactly what I wanted from national security, but what's the next step? And the next step was finding a solution. So we went to all these experts that come to all these international meetings, and we asked them all if they believe in a WMD-free zone, if they believe, even if not people from the zone, and they didn't. And we went to see all those panel after panel after panel at the UN and international conferences. I heard so many Europeans talking about the Middle East. It's almost as interesting as listening to men talking about breastfeeding. I think that when we tried to map what people are thinking about the possibility of the zone, nobody believed in the zone. But when we asked, and we started to do mapping with friends from the UK, with the international community, because that's the only way we can operate in the Middle East right now. With the help, we started a series of roundtables trying to ask questions, even the Israelis. Because surprise, the Israelis will talk to me if there's an international in the room. If I invite internationals to Israel, then suddenly they talk to me because they don't want me to be the only voice in the room. So the best way to bring them was to invite internationals. And then we started mapping. What are the obstacles? Why do people do not believe? We went to international meetings where we could meet with Arab diplomats and in closed rooms. We used the help of international organizations so they can help us meet, because we're not allowed to talk to each other usually, or to be seen together. We used to only talk to each other when there's a European in the middle.
I don't know.
And we started mapping the obstacles, and there was a huge list. And then we took this list and we divided it to two columns. Problems that have solutions, technical solutions like mechanism of compliance, surveillance, discussions, talks, confidence building measures, and the problems, the obstacles that are only there because they just don't believe, or don't want to believe, or just don't have goodwill. And surprisingly, all the problems in the column of can it be solvable were gone. We found solutions to each one of them, apart from one, and the rest of them were just in the no goodwill. We took all the obstacles and we tried to and started to paint a solution. We wanted the international organizations, we wanted the lawyers, the international lawyers to write us a model of a draft treaty for the zone. It didn't happen. So we did it ourselves, civil society, not experts. And then again, we used our friends in England, in this case, Paul Ingram of BASIC, to send this draft treaty that we thought might be funny to the diplomats in Israel, in the Arab states, in Iran, to the British Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to everybody he knew, everybody that was on his mailing list, and we allowed them to assume that it was a group of people from the zone and outside the zone that wrote it, mainly men. And when they received it, even people from the Arab League themselves, the answer that the British guy got was, wow. We had a group of wise men that worked on for 11 years on that and didn't come up with such a text, with a solution. Now, it's not because they were not wise, and I guess also not because they were wise men. It was because they didn't believe in a solution, and when you do not believe in a solution, but you keep campaigning for it, you will not get a result. You need to look for a solution in something that you believe you can make happen, or you just don't do it. We took that very happily, introduced it at our first side event at the UN with a draft treaty. And it was very interesting what happened in that room. Everybody in the room were against the draft treaty. But the first thing that we said, because we're a civil society, and in a civil society, the first thing that we need to lose is our egos. So the first thing we said was, apart from always saying we wrote, we did, without saying who did it, the first thing that we said, this is a draft, it's a draft only. Don't fight with us over the words. If you don't like a word, take it and change it. We do not send it by PDFs, if you like. We'll send it by Word if you ask. Cut, paste, make changes. We really are not going to fight on any word in this draft treaty. Find any solution as you like. And what we've done since then is with them, keep writing draft treaties. We're now on our 4th and 5th at the same time, just because we want to show that for every article, there are different solutions. And what we said at the end of the first meeting, and that was a game changer for us, it was in 2017, first cycle of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in Vienna. What we said is to the diplomats there, and we had a room, we were lucky, we had a room filled with diplomats from the zone. Now you can't say it's impossible. Now it's a possibility. This way, that way, take this article, take that article. One thing you can't say anymore, and that's that it's impossible. We're calling all of our events at the UN Achieving the Possible, and we demand that will be the language. And you know something, sometimes civil society can make it. Because in 2018, as Emad said, they went for exactly this, a draft treaty. A treaty, not a draft. But they are using our draft and they are talking to us. And I don't know how to say it without sounding full of ego, but when Arab states are inviting an organization and they're inviting an Israeli to a room where Israel is not present and when they discuss the future of the zone, I think that we show that civil society can get to places if we really believe in what we're doing, but we're also proactive about it. We're not waiting for somebody to write something for us. We're not waiting to be invited to talk. I'll give you one example. I really wanted to talk to our own foreign ministry. The Israeli foreign ministry is not a fan of mine, but they will. It's only a question of time. And when I went there to the meeting, I was very scared. I knew that they don't like me. I knew that I'm going to meet these people that know things, and I'm not an academic, I'm just an activist. And I came to the meeting in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the ambassador that represents Israel in UN functions, like, hi there. I entered the room, and the first thing he asked me was, are you a traitor? And I was so shocked because he was such a polite man on international places. And when I entered, and the first thing was, "Are you a traitor?" And my answer was, "No, I think you are." And he was so shocked that I could give him a 5-minute speech because he's, he was still with his mouth open. And what I said to him is very similar to what you just heard from Emad. I said, we are at the crossroad. We are looking at the crossroad. Saudi Arabia is getting missiles that can carry nuclear weapons. And they have nuclear programs. Iran doesn't have a nuclear program because they decided, they have a nuclear program. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons because they haven't decided to build them, but once they decide to build them, they'll build them and Saudi will follow immediately. Even if Iran will not build nuclear program, Saudi might get nuclear program and then Iran will have to. And if Saudi will do that, then Egypt will do that. We are looking, if we continue like this, we're looking at a possible nuclear arm race in the Middle East. I'm sure that in the drawer, you have plans of how to bomb this and how to bomb that, but you cannot bomb Saudi, you cannot bomb the Emirates, you cannot bomb Jordan, you cannot bomb Egypt. All of them have nuclear programs because they're all allies of the US. So I don't know what your plan is. I think mine is better. Let's have a discussion. And the answer of this guy, which sadly left after a year, was let's start talking. So you see, even there can be a discussion if we take the responsibility of saying what is important without our own ego, without hate speech, without bashing, but with finding a solution and stick to it. I think I'll pass to you now, Emad, about how we're doing it and where we are.
All right. So having an idea or a vision of a WMD free zone in the Middle East sounds great. If it was that easy, it would have been done already, am I right? And usually we have a great idea what we want to do, and then we say, how are we going to do it? And that's a tricky part. How do we address such a complex issue that is so layered, as we have discussed, from global powers, from regional dimensions, to even national dimensions, and then go to sub-nations, and all these identities, and all these crises that are happening in the Middle East. And we're talking about, let's make a WMD free zone in the Middle East? Really? And how are you going to go about doing that? So we took a very comprehensive look at this, and we decided, all right, remember, number one, that we are civil society. We can move faster than governments on basically everything. We can speak truth to power, where the truth, if we can't do that, then there's no role for civil society to be pushing for these issues. We need to be able to stand up in the face of people who are your enemies, your nemesis, and say to them, listen, you are being a traitor to your own people for the fact that you are taking away their right to just decency and security and human security. Because ultimately what we are working on is to achieve a much higher emphasis of those who represent their people on human security and not just state security. That if I arm myself to the teeth, I can still not remain in power, I can also crumble. But if I can provide the socioeconomic, political, and other facets of life to my population, then maybe then I will have the legitimacy to continue ruling. So when we looked at it, we decided, all right, our first primary goal right now is to make a progress and advance the prospect of a WMD free zone in the Middle East. How we want to do it is through three major branches. One is to have actually a treaty text, to actually have something tangible. Here we go, legal document that you can play around. And Sharon just mentioned about the whole draft treaty process. It is continuously evolving. And the reason why it's always a draft is that we're not governments. My signature will not do anything on that treaty text. Governments have to sign on to it. So our job is to just continuously evolve. We have actually like an artificial intelligence, machine learning capabilities within our little organization on continuously adapting to the realities in the region. So if something moves forward, we push on that. If something changes, we also change our direction very quickly. So we're nimble. So one is this sort of policy track which provides solutions to governments and to other stakeholders that are involved in the negotiations on an official diplomatic level. And number two, we also work on capacity building, education, because reality is that if there is no capacity within the region, if there's no idea of how do we go about establishing a WMD-free zone, what does verification mean? What does monitoring mean? Where does it cross the line between sovereign rights and like international law? These are all technical things that we got to figure out. So we need capacity building programs that provides, for example, through our METO's university network, we have now in about 19 countries representatives in different universities that actually now are talking about how do we insert the issue of WMD-free zone into our discussions when we're dealing with the Middle East. Number two, we're talking about we have just launched our own educational program where it's online, it's free to students from the Middle East and a very little fee for those that are outside. And it provides another forum whereby you come and you learn in a month's time everything to do with WMD-free zone in the Middle East. So we have an educational course, we have this capacity building training program that we have for different stakeholders, and that provides the second leg of our strategy. And then finally, we have our third one, which is where a lot of us come into play. And this is our activism, this is our campaigning, is to really get the message out. Because without getting the message out, solutions are not there to be even observed. We need to galvanize society within the region and outside to see that there is a better way forward, that there are solutions out there, and to bring the importance of disarmament and non-proliferation on the top of the agenda of many of these governments by grassroots pressure as well. So we do a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, so we can converge these two worlds together and bring as many of the stakeholders as we can. This feeds into our other strategy, which is about building partnerships with like-minded civil society organizations, with institutions, think tanks, academic institutions that are providing us the expertise and providing us the, again, exposure. We have amazing organizations that are part of our coalition, that some of them are Nobel Peace Prize winning organizations. We're part of ICANN, IPPNW, all of these acronyms that actually mean something behind them. These amazing organizations are really pushing for disarmament and denuclearization across the world. Not just that, we also publish, because we have to actually be able to have the resources that provides the, where do we get our sources? Where are we coming up with these facts and figures to frame our arguments and so forth? So we have publications on across different platforms, may that be written or read for essays, journals, articles, and so forth. Of course, interviews, social media outreach, and all of these other messaging and promotion and broadcasting of our ideas. And the fact that in reality, there's very few people that are going to say, you know what, I don't want a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. I really like it the way it is. Let's continue blowing ourselves up and causing more harm. So we have a good vision, one that is based on providing the security and the prosperity that this region deserves and is capable of achieving. And most important, the way that we go about all of this is to make sure that we're inclusive in the way we approach it. We do not close the doors to any governments. We don't close the doors to any other stakeholders that want to engage with us. This allows us to have the diversity of voices to come in so that we can then really assess how do we go about providing some of that comfort and security that some countries may really feel that they are threatened by country X or Y. And in all of this, we bring people together, and we bring them through what we're doing now to very quiet, closed-door meetings that are just negotiations. It's called track 1.5 diplomacy, but you have to remember that. And it's about bringing the key stakeholders in governments and former government officials to sit down in a room, in a hotel maybe, somewhere, in a very neutral state. There's no neutral state, but let's say in the case of Middle East, we can't have it in the Middle East. So like Switzerland, Norway, other places like that. And exactly, we love Cyprus for some reason. It's very nice weather, close proximity, and they think they're part of Europe, but it's okay. We will get to that in a different way. By bringing these individuals together, I want to just leave you with one example of how we can actually change mindsets. In this, one of these negotiations over the draft treaty, we brought these experts and these officials into one room for 4 days. We're like, listen, this is the text. We're not married to it. Don't worry, do whatever you want with it, but let's discuss it. And as we discuss this over 4 days, day one, it will be like, Sharon would be, actually what Sharon, let's say, would be the Israeli and I'm the Iranian. And, we won't even acknowledge each other. That's day one. By day 4, they were hugging each other when we had to say goodbye. And more important than that is that on day 1, they wanted to focus on obstacles. I don't like you because of X, Y, and Z. The history is messed up because of A, B, C. But you know what? We said, fine. In our program, we will discuss obstacles. But we put it all the way at the end of the program. And in the past 3 days of negotiations, when we got to the final session that was about obstacles, do you know what these government officials, that they came there in their personal capacity with experts, said to us? Like, you know what? We don't want to discuss the obstacles. We want to figure out how do we protect this process of engagement and dialogue. Because it is that precious for us to be able to be in one room where we're supposed to be enemies, but ultimately we realize, wait a minute, you're actually much closer to me than a Norwegian. I mean, I hope there's no Norwegians in the room, but the idea is an Israeli, an Arab, and an Iranian have much more in common with the realities that they're facing in the region, and just even culturally, historically, and so forth, that brings them actually together. And then these differences that we may have are a little bit more diluted. We give strength to what brings us and connects us, and we try to extract the energy out of what brings us to be separated. Just like a nuclear bomb. The emphasis was you can either have a nuclear explosion through fusion of atoms or through fission of separation. If we can bring the region together, it can result in not only a possibility of an enormous amount of energy to be unleashed, but that energy can be for constructive or destructive purposes. The track and the decision to which one we want to go to really rests with the civil society, with these governments that at some point want to also live in a good and secure place. Because the vulnerabilities they face, even if they're surrounded by the most sophisticated weapons, that ultimately they want also some peace and security. So we have to get to the heart of these individuals. Because when we say the government of X and Y are negotiating, it's not governments that negotiate, there are people that negotiate. The reason why, for example, when it came to the Iran nuclear deal and the negotiations around that, in 2013, the stars aligned. There was a government in the US, the Obama administration, that was open to discussion and diplomacy. There was a new government in Iran under Rouhani that said, you know what, we want to engage with the world. Let's discuss this. And for the first time, world powers sat in the United Nations and negotiated in earnest for 2 years and resulted in the Iranian nuclear. Now, I worked my heart and mind on this issue. And I remember the day that we achieved this Iran nuclear deal and the comprehensiveness of this agreement, that it for first time was a clear message that, like how the Iraq WMD program and accusations of Saddam amassing and expanding his WMD program resulted in the US-UK invasion in 2003. Fast forward, we were also close to another regional war that was going to be started. But it was averted because the decision at the political level was made that we will invest political will, the resources, and the time to actually reach an agreement. And you know what the madness of all of this is? Is that while President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, and while the Iranian nuclear deal right now is on its knees, it's not dead. And for the Europeans who are party European Union, among the key countries in there being Germany, France, and until lately, United Kingdom, are signatories to this agreement. And if you go through this 183 pages of text, one thing happened inadvertently without them even realizing. That NPT that we were talking about, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, these treaties are mostly written by whom? By world powers. It was basically drafted between the Soviet Union and the Americans, compromised by the Europeans, and then passed. These laws, these international laws, are written by the most powerful to enforce their will, their perspective on the other. And so the NPT had some loopholes because those nuclear weapon states that Sharon mentioned earlier on wanted a little bit of loopholes to be able to support their allies, to be able to develop their nuclear programs, and to provide the assistance that may require, and they use it as a political chip. In the discussions over Iran's nuclear program, because Iran is seen as a Malay state, as something that's going to be threatening the negotiations, and Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has the right to blah, 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 to a civilian nuclear program. But this agreement closed almost 99% of every loophole that was already in the NPT that provided a diversion to a nuclear weapons program. Iran's nuclear program as of 2018, actually 2019 May, was under the 24/7 watch of the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's the nuclear watchdog that implements the verification and monitoring of Iran's nuclear program. And for that, Iran was playing to the agreement and was not at all diverting towards any option of nuclear weapons. Now that treaty text, that agreement, sorry, not treaty text, that agreement between the world powers and Iran, if you go through it, you realize that they only did that to close Iran off to nuclear weapons. But in doing so, if we actually see the value in this agreement, it can be expanded across the region, across the world. It can actually contribute to global non-proliferation if we look at this text, because they forced one country that they have a problem with to basically close off any avenues to nuclear weapons. If they can do it to Iran, they can do it to the rest of the world. And most importantly, ultimately, it's a tool that we can use to then bring it back and say to the world powers, enough of your dragging your feet about disarmament. Because under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, one pillar is that these nuclear weapon states disarm. And we are here today, and as Jeremy mentioned yesterday, and what you've heard from Sharon, that these nuclear weapon states, including United Kingdom, United States, and the Russians, and the Chinese, and the French, are expanding and building more sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. And these weapons, these nuclear weapons, this generation of nuclear weapons we have now today are the magnitude of like 1,000, 10,000 times more lethal than the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And these are from these nuclear weapon states, some of them are supposedly democratic states. That's where you guys also come in. We can look at the Middle East as being in a mess, but these nuclear weapons are also sitting on this continent. They're also your Armageddon awaiting. So we have to be really clear-eyed about what we're trying to do. So partnerships, capacity building, education, discussion, diplomacy, track 1.5. We go to every international conference and we present. We bug them, we push them, we say, listen, look at this, look at this, look at this. We build partnerships, relationships, because this will require a collective effort. And that's why we have looked at it from a regional perspective. And most importantly, the solution that we are proposing comes from within the Middle East. It is something that is rooted and gave birth, the genesis is in the region. So we need to find solutions that come from those who know the region the best, who are living their experiences in that geography, in that reality. And so this is why when we were at this conference in 2019 in November, what was fascinating, and the first time I've seen that in any conference or any discussion, was that there was an Arab woman presiding over these negotiations. and the seats were in circle. And all the Arab states plus Iran are in the first circle, with the seat of Israel empty. And in the periphery of the room was the seats for the global powers and international institutions. That it actually just the optics was the first time that the Middle East was at the center with Middle Easterners talking about the Middle East, discussing the way forward for the Middle East, with the world powers on the periphery. That peripheral world powers sitting there can either contribute to the process, or they can feed again the means of destruction that is a profiteering mechanism for the ultra wealthy rich in these developed economies that are actually profiting from the blood, treasure, and resources of the Middle East. So we have to be really clear about what is actually happening in this power dynamics. I'm going to stop there, if that's okay, and pass it back to Sharon.
So where are we going? You made a mess, I'm just saying. We have the list of what we always do. So I have to look for a second. Where are we going? So I'll tell you a little story about things that frustrates me. One of the things that frustrates me is when I hear lots and lots and lots of colleagues of mine from around the world, those I'm supposed to be in solidarity with, leftists, and the way that they are talking about, for example, Israel-Palestine, to be very exact, and about the zone in general. How they talk at the zone and not with the zone. How many times did I hear people from Britain, from France saying, why can't you just fill in the blank? Why can't you just get rid of it? Why can't you just live in peace? What can we do to help you? How can we teach you? How can we assist you? So this kind of talks from leftists are even more painful, because that I will not accept, not anymore. People look at the Middle East and they assume things. People look at people in color and they assume things. People look at people that are in poverty and assume things, like it's much easier for them to walk 2 kilometers to school. You know, they're so used to it. We're looking at people that are different than us, and what can we do? The whole of the Middle East is full of people of color that behave a bit different than you and have different circumstances, and yet they're just the same as you. We just don't hear them. And when I walk around, and for years, I mean, I'm 52 yesterday.
You're 52?
Yesterday. And I've stopped school. I dropped out of school at the age of 14 and became an activist. And this kind of talks towards Middle Easterns is something that I dealt with in the vast majority of my life. This is one thing. The other thing is how we look at the Middle East when it comes to diplomacy and when it comes to the zone, when right now it's in its most precious place if we're looking at it. And what does it mean, precious place? After decades of talking about the zone without believing it's possible, and after decades of fueling hate into the zone and fueling arms into the zone, we really do have a real process now. The November conference, a UN conference to solve the one thing that all the states in the zone agree on. And yet, all states in the zone agree on that, even Israel. Maybe they're not in the room, but officially they are agree. They just want to feel safe first. And yet, there's so many hazards because states keep talking about the zone. There's now UN discussions about security. There will be the Non-Proliferation Treaty soon. States calling on other states to behave. States putting pressure on the Middle East. States are trying, for example, to not sign. They did not want to sign. The states did not want to sign the ban treaty. And there was a huge important meeting, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the treaty was about the discussions of the whole states, like 193 states were about to finish, and they did not find a document that they can all agree on because of the ban treaty. So in the last day, they called on a resolution for the Middle East, and then they say, oh, because of Israel, there's no final document. Now, the funny thing is Israel is not party to the NPT. Israel is not there in the room, and yet this statement by itself could have sparkled a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. So where we are right now is at a very precious point for all of us. And yet, if we continue to talk as business as usual, we might really harm the process. But there's a precious process that we all need to protect. We're protecting it, but keep feeding them with solutions. Talk about the solutions. Talk about the things that you might agree. And you know what? And again, I know it sounds like I'm full of ego here, but we have a government from the zone telling us that our work is cutting 5 years of deliberations for them while we were happy that day. We had some frozen margaritas. Well-earned ones. At the same time, the frustration when we have to keep explaining that your expectations from people in the Middle East have to be the same expectations as you have from your own. And that got us to do two different things. One, we said that we are writing multiple treaties, right? We have two treaties coming up. The next treaty that's coming up on the 27th of October is a treaty that shows that there can be a regional layer, meaning all the states in the zone will be able to monitor each other, solve problems together in a building that will be located right outside the regions where they can all meet and work together on confidence building measures and ways of monitoring each other. This is one thing. The other treaty that we're doing is a WMD-free zone in Europe and England, because it's about time that when you ask us how you can help, the answer is by example. And if you haven't written a WMD-free zone, we will help you because it's okay for the Middle Easterns to help Europe, and we're here for you. And the second thing, major project that we're starting, we're calling remapping the Middle East. Because when we're looking at security in the Middle East, WMDs is just the one thing that the states are willing to talk about. And we're there with them talking about it because that's what they're willing to talk about. But we want to take the conversation a bit further. They're willing to talk about nuclear, right? And nuclear includes nuclear energy. Nuclear energy brings us to climate change. And for climate change, we don't want them to keep building nuclear reactors in the Middle East. We want them to talk about sustainable solutions. And we want to create the room for that too, because it's all part of security. We don't want to talk about the security that just they want to talk. We want to talk about the security that we care about. Maybe we are from the Middle East, but we want a discussion about security that is different than what we deserve or earn now, because we ourselves don't know what is the Middle East for us, because we're so torn, we're so made up region by others that now we need to look at the Middle East in new eyes. What is security for the Middle East? We can't keep demanding security for the Middle East if we in the Middle East don't know. And we have amazing group of students, the same students that were benefited from Emad's METO university course are now joining us, and each couple of students are looking at each state in the Middle East to look at all of the civil society organizations, ask them what security is to them, ask them, and for us to know and for them to look at the huge, huge difference between what is state security and human security, and how can it be that the state security is usually totally contradicts our own security. If you need examples, I'll give you, but I don't want to overreach. So we are doing now the remapping. While we keep working on draft treaties, and while we keep our diplomacy, we're also looking at what really is security for us, and then try to pursue it with the same organization that's called Middle East Treaty Organization. We never said which treaty. It can be treaty for water safety, and it can be treaty for food security, and it can be a treaty for human trafficking. But the one thing that is sure that is we're going to totally look in a different way at human security in the Middle East, and you're all welcome to join us at that. Thank you very much.
All right. We've come a long way from the beginning of this session. We've covered a lot of ground. All right. Tony, how long do we have?
It's 3:15.
All right, perfect. We'll get into Q&A in a second. All right. As Sharon said, for us, the WMD free zone in the Middle East is just one stop on a much longer road. We have a very big vision of where the Middle East can go and can become. And we want to believe that there is an alternative pathway that will establish the unity among countries where we can actually have, environmental justice and security, where we can have socio-economic political development that is not cut from the roots, that is not being decapitated constantly by the involvement of specific small groups in each of these elites, the elite group within each of these countries that on no level are democratic. But the alliances they have, and again here, power comes into play. Because when we want to look at the future, we need also a change in the mindset of those who believe that by just backing a few elites within each of these countries, they can maintain their interest in those geographies. But ultimately, when we saw the Arab Spring and the uprising that happened in 2009, 2010, it did topple down some of these dictators. But there was not enough time for society to even breathe before other coups d'etats were engineered, other activists were just disappearing. Where now, for example, when we look at the largest recipients of US military aid, it's Israel and Egypt. When we look at the largest export of the United States weapon, which is the largest export in the world, half of it goes into the Middle East, half of it. And half of that goes to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. If these are the allies of democratic countries, then I do not know what democracy is. So we need to hold account our own governments if we are in one of these countries that are providing the nourishment to the dictators. These autocratic regimes do not represent their people or their wishes. They represent their own narrow objectives of remaining in power. And they're remaining in power because they're sustained and by these global powers who, again, have their interests in making sure this continues. So, what can you do to assist in this journey? Number one, if you are in one of these countries, instead of going to protest against country X, Y, and Z in the Middle East, focus on your own Department of Defense. Go outside of these major multinationals that are actually feeding the war in the Middle East. Find out what is the relationship, trade agreements between your governments and these countries. If the countries that you're in, that are democratic, that are preaching human rights, then for heaven's sake, stop stumbling on it for a few bucks in the Middle East. That's number one. Number two, please get yourself educated about this, the issue of a WMD free zone, because we see it as a gateway to a much broader regional security and stability. So joining us now is just a step towards opening it up to other fields, as Sharon said, into the environment and social issues. So you can have your intake and your input coming in from many directions. Number three, if you can volunteer in your time or your expertise, again, visit our website. It's wmd-free.me. I'm sure Tony will make it happen for us. If you are wealthy individually or know somebody very wealthy and wants to contribute to our organization, of course, we're always happy to be resourced so we can do our programs and have a proper, impactful outreach. These are just some of the basic ways we can help in joining the METO movement. But most importantly, as Sharon always emphasized, is that you have to believe with us that an alternative reality is possible. And this vision of the future we have is actually not that crazy. The fact, again, that our organization has people from across the region and beyond in itself is creating the reality of the future today. We are saying that if we can put our differences aside, so can our governments. And we have to be an example. This is why, while it comes with a lot of risks, we still put our neck out there because we believe in what reality could be and possible for a much broader, larger population in our region. And to make the case over here in Europe is to remind the Europeans that they went through 2 world wars. that killed 80 million collectively in those two world wars. The Europeans made that mistake once after World War I, and they did it again in World War II. And after World War II, where imagine if you're sitting there in 1945 or 1947, and you say, you know what, guys, I think we should talk instead of kill each other. So, well, somebody did, and started the seeds of what is now European Union. The French and the Germans have butchered each other for centuries, and suddenly they stand up and say, you are my closest friends. Spain and Portugal has issues. We can go to Iberia and see what has happened in the south of Europe and the challenges and battles and the wars that have been unleashed amongst Europeans. So the process of learning from how the European Union became a reality in the aftermath of World War II is one that we do not need to wait for a World War III to figure out in the Middle East. And if there's one place where things are going to go really bad and it's going to impact us all, is in the Middle East. While we don't like the word Middle East because it's a Western term, what happens in the Middle East will impact the continents all around it. There's no ways once the wave hits and the damage will be unleashed across the region. So it is in the benefit of our collective human security to be able to be really clear-eyed about these triggers that are right now being pressed within the Middle East and is going to implode, and by its implosion, it will explode outwards and it will damage all of us. So if you don't care about the Middle East, care about yourselves first. And in that doing so, find the interest in pushing this agenda of a doubling the free zone in the Middle East forward, and make the arguments within your own communities that this is actually about our collective security and not just the Middle East. But I want to end with a positive note, because the vision that we have seen, we believe, we have tasted it, I have dreamt it, we have painted it. Because really, the Middle East, don't look at it like it is today. There was a time when the Middle East was the center of civilization. It was where, a lot of people in Spain seem to really love this one guy from the Middle East called Jesus. I mean, this is the reality. He's from religion to philosophy, to astrology, to mathematics, to sciences. Spain, when you look at the history of Spain, the golden age of Islam, it was when the information and knowledge was distributed, and one of the epicenters was in Spain. While we want to erase that, we have to remember that not long ago, that Islam, the Arabs, the region of the Middle East, and all the facets that was components of it, and the fact that when we had Andalusia, it was when the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims worked together to expand knowledge. I'm bringing in religion because it is important in the Middle East. We can't escape it. And we have to find gateways that bring these religions together. That if the essence of what we want to achieve is about humanity, is about our own future, that in the end, it's again very cheesy, and we have brought it up, but it's truly about love. We have to figure out that there's a better way than butchering each other to be able to communicate. That we can actually find so much that can make us reach the truth of how we can get this message out. And as long as we remain true to our truth, to the knowledge, to facts, and to back it up with real sciences and whatever that it allows us to make it that everybody else can interpret it in the right way, I believe that the Middle East, with your help, with Sharon and our team at METO, we can really push this agenda forward and see it as just a trigger, not for an explosion, but for an opening to a much wider scope of opportunities, because the Middle East has it all. Has it all. Damn, and it's beautiful. And it's young demographics. We're ready. We've got it. We just need just a chance. And that chance will come if we have a broad coalition of supporters from every walk of life to just chip at this wall of mistrust, chip at this wall of animosity, of hate. We need to just do our little part and chip at that wall, and that wall will crack. It always does. It happened in South Africa. It happened in Germany, and will happen in the Middle East. We will break down these walls. Please join us and chip with us to break it. Thank you. So this is an opportunity for Q&A.
I think totally not. Yes.
Hi, I'm Eva. I'm from the Student of International Relations. Thank you so much for your speech. I just wanted to ask, well, you've been talking about your work has included a lot of networking and inclusiveness, of course, in the Middle East and from the outside, but especially in the Middle East. And my question was, where is the Palestinian people in this equation? Has there been any also, like, are they included in this conversation, and how, and have you been directly in this conversation with them? And because obviously they are, well, they are vulnerable in this, like, if this situation of you've mentioned a possible escalation of or nuclear military race, there would be one of the main vulnerable populations in the Middle East. So have they been included in this conversation that you talked about?
Yes.
Sharon, sorry, what was the question for the guys online?
The question was, well, if the Palestinians were involved in the conversation, the answer is yes. Just like any of the other states. When we said 24 states, Palestine is one of them. Now, let's face it, Palestine is not a state, but it does have an observer status in several, and in the November conference room, they have a seat just like any other state. So yeah, just like any other states in the region, they have a room at the table. And of course, in our table too, because our table is inclusive. And can I ask you, why do you ask about Palestine and not Djibouti, for example?
I was just interested in the question. You have mentioned Djibouti.
Okay. Yeah. So all 24 states are, of course, yeah, we're inclusive. Inclusive means inclusive. That's it. There's no way, but not inclusive. Any other questions?
Just to add that while it is an inclusive process and Palestine does have a seat, it does not mean that they are equal amongst the players inside the room. So again, here we have to make sure, yes, you need to reach consensus, and that allows for some playing field to be leveled. What does it mean? It means that when they reach an agreement, the text, all 24 have to sign on. If one says, I'm not happy with this, it cannot be agreed upon. So this gives actually Palestine quite an important voice in this process. And so it does to smaller countries and larger countries across the region. So it's an important platform.
There's a comment that's just come in. It says, if there's an Israeli on the panel, there should be a Palestinian on the panel also.
Well, since we're not talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think it's irrelevant. I mean, we do need to have an Arab, not a Palestinian. If the Arab is a Palestinian, great. But we're talking about 24 states. And the only reason that if there's an Israeli, there should be a Palestinian is because there's prejudice against me as an Israeli. I came here not as an Israeli. I came here as a Middle Eastern, offering with my Middle Eastern friends a solution for the Middle East. That's it. Now,
will have a
it doesn't just one, and to say one more thing. In METO, we don't have discriminatory. We don't discriminate. And it's very important for us. If a Palestinian wants to be in, they're in. I'll tell you even more. In our core team, there are people from Palestine, from Egypt, and other places in the Middle East. But we also need to keep them safe. For them to say that they're working with an Israeli or with an Iranian might endanger them. And that's also part of the complexity. While I can talk or decide to talk wherever I want, some people, just because they're talking to an Israeli, and it doesn't matter what I am, what I do, what I think, none of that matter just because I was born in Israel. They won't say that they're talking to me, and they'll ask me questions about irrelevant things just because I'm Israeli. We don't do that in METO. In METO, we are Middle Easterns. I work in Israel. I was born in Israel. I am an Israeli. Yes. But we're Middle Easterns working together.
There was a question over there.
Yeah, thanks so much for this epic talk. It's really, really fascinating. I want to know more about like the treaty writing process, and I'm asking with the perspective of being one of the founders of demilitarized education. We're trying to get universities to break their ties with the global arms trade. And, you know, we have similar kind of process of like, at the moment we're quite a baby organization, but we like created a database and students can upload research about their university connection to the arms trade. And then you can ask that university to demilitarize through like, you know, the letter. I'm wondering if you can improve that by kind of getting women into more of like treaty vibes.
Well, first, yes, maybe. I mean, each campaign was, for us, it's first and foremost a campaign. We thought that we're an activist. As an activist, we thought that the experts will do it, but we kind of had to school ourselves. I mean, not Emad, I have to school myself. Emad already knew it all. But as activists, we talked the language that they understand, but we tried very much to only do it when we write a treaty. And the rest of the time, we don't talk like a state. We're not trying to fight over words, commas, where it should be and what does it mean. No, there's a solution. If you don't like to change it, just do that. The treaty, the writing of the treaty process was at the beginning just research. How do treaty looks like, okay? We didn't have the Ben Treaty. When we first introduced the draft treaty, it was in 2016, 17, as I said, and it wasn't a good draft. And that was the first thing we said. Okay, it's just a draft. We're not married to it. Let's make it better together. And then we invited people from Palestine and other places in the Middle East, but with international experts to sit with us. And we did several roundtables. And one thing that we promised was that it's a secret. We will never say who was in the room, and we had to build trust. Do you know what it means for these diplomats to sit with Emad and with me and discuss this text? Emad started to talk to you about this meeting in Zurich. This meeting in Zurich for us was a miracle. We were planning every tiny session. We were planning the coffee breaks. Coffee breaks are very important. We were planning how people eat because we wanted to make sure that they keep talking. It was for us the first time that we managed to bring people from almost 24 states, including Israelis in the room, including Iranians in the room to discuss a text that was written also by an Israeli without them knowing. On the first day, they asked who wrote this. We need to understand the structure. And we needed to say. And we thought that they leave the room. But they didn't. They just wanted to make it better with us. And on the last day, as Emad said, we said, okay, time to talk about the obstacles, which the one thing that they always talked to until the day in Zurich, that's the only thing that they were willing to talk about. And that was for us, the tipping point, because that's when they said in the process of writing the draft treaty, now it's time to protect the process and stop dwelling on that. Now it's the same diplomats. It doesn't mean that when they're not in their own capacity, they will say the same things. But they did ask us to send the draft treaty in Word and not PDF so they can produce their own draft treaties. And you know what? They are, which is amazing. And that's the process, to write and release, and say, you don't like this article? That's a great opportunity. Let's have a roundtable online. Let's discuss this. Let's build bridges just by disagreeing on something. And it means we disagree, let's make it better. Not you disagree with me, let's fight over it. Just let's make it better.
And in legal text, that's not.
And if you want to do things with us like this, yeah, come on, let's do it together. Fine.
As my father says, you always need to have a good lawyer, a good accountant, and a good doctor.
Money to favor.
All right, that was negotiable. But on these three things, you should not forget, again, it's your health, all right? You will always need to have something that takes care of you. And then when it comes to your lawyer, it's because a lot of our functionings in our society is actually based on from constitutional law to national law to city law. So actually the legal track is quite key for us because it sort of puts the foundation in place. But it doesn't mean that for every campaign you got to go a legal track. We just thought this was the most boring way, and for diplomats to like glide over, and hopefully there'll be a little bit less, problematic for us. But we got to keep it dry so it can actually create those boundaries on how do we go about making this happen. And again, the European Union is based on a lot of laws. These cooperations between the countries of Europe are set in law. So it's important. But what is actually very important too, and this is where the accountant comes in, is that we got to watch out and make sure that we shine a light on those who are profiting from war. And here you're exactly on point. But nobody at this time and age, I don't know that many people, if I'm an engineer in an arms factory, I don't know if I have the heart to go and tell my kid what I'm actually doing. But most probably, that same engineer is working for a company that builds your civilian airplanes. That is why actually the 4 largest contractors to the Department of Defense of the United States are private companies. Those private companies sit on that country's stock exchange. That company is publicly traded. Actually, one of the largest Spanish military contributors is a publicly traded company. You can actually figure out what they make, who's their leadership, and come on, then use your imagination, use your activism, use your campaign, and you can go to the heart of this and use legal action to find a way to then dismantle this facade that creates it, that merges civilian and military components into one. So the privatization of the means of war is actually an opening for civil society to tap it. Because you can find the legal grounding and the accounting, the finances, to really put a spotlight on it. And it is the same Boeing that makes you fly your easy jets that is also dropping and building the jets that are dropping bombs on Yemen. This is happening simultaneously at the same time. Weed them out and find a way to do it through grassroots and shame those people who are sitting on their boards. You can do that.
Yes.
If you take Israel out of the equation, do you feel like all the other Arab states plus Iran are supportive of this so completely, or are there things like the Saudi-Iran dynamic that is sort of concerning you? Like, do you feel like you're worried about any of the other countries as well?
Yeah, I'm very worried about each of the states. I mean, think about Europe, okay? Do you get the European states to agree on everything? No, this is the Middle East. We're not used to agree on anything. We don't have a union. We're not doing it usually. But I don't want to take Israel out of the equation. I want to bring Israel into the equation. Now, when Emad talked about the November conference, he said 2 states are not there, Iran and Israel, right? The US and Israel.
Iran was there. Come on, guys. I have to connect. This is how it sneaks in.
And you can look at it as a bad thing, right? Most people automatically looked at it as a bad thing. What does it worth if Iran and Israel is not, if US and Israel is not there?
Sharon.
Sorry.
This is how wars start.
I know where you mean. So it's a good thing, because these 22 states or 23 states that are in the room are not in full agreement. I mean, on the last day of the November conference, we were sitting out there worrying sick because they kicked all of us out and were shouting inside until 10 p.m. Trust me, we were worried. No, of course they don't understand or agreed on everything, but they do agree on one thing, and that's they want Israel to disarm. On this they agree. Now we take this agreement and we do what we can with it. So you want Israel to disarm. Let's create a document. Now Israel is not in the room. It means that if you work fast enough, you might get to a text that will be agreed by all 23 states. And it's so good that when Israel will even consider, Israel will have something ready to join. But if Israel is in the room now and Israel is not ready, and every decision has to be made by consensus, Israel in the room will stop the whole process. So for us, Israel not in the room is an opportunity, it's not an obstacle. But also this is how you do activism. You look at what you've got and you push for the best result out of it.
And just
I would
quickly,
like to,
just quickly on the process, because remember, the fact that this is actually happening, that this conference is happening, it's the first time these governments actually have sat down together on one thing and deals with their region. So it's the process that has begun. And that process will be long, but throughout it, there's confidence building measures, there's trust building, and hopefully it's just a venue for them to start on a longer journey to find things that are common. And that's why we're hoping that, in these conversations, they can expand to other issues. Any other questions? Are we good? Did we cover it all? Do we have Middle East peace already?
thank you so much for coming.
All right.
We have.
We're good. I think we covered it. Are we free? Are we free to be? And please do reach out to us, and we're at your disposal as well. If you need any clarity on any of these questions, this is what we literally live, breathe, and sleep on. So we really are quite deep into it. And I hope that in one way or another, you will stay in contact. Thank you so much.